I'm going to move on to a second issue, the first news item for this episode, which is the Aged Care Royal Commission. It was announced in September last year, and hearings kicked off in Adelaide this week. And, well, why? What caused it? Well, actually, the Prime Minister indicated. Statistics were released around that time that showed a 170% increase in serious risk notices given to aged care providers and a 292% increase in significant non-compliance in the sector over a one-year period. That's when Prime Minister Scott Morrison said, when you're confronted with that, you ask a simple question. How widespread is this? Does it touch the whole sector? Now, until we have clear answers to those questions, I think Australians will be unsure. And there's evidence to suggest that he's onto something, that this is a really good idea. In fact, I applaud it. I think it's a fantastic idea. But there's more evidence just than those stats. If you look at the Council of Ageing of Australia, they say that elder abuse is an epidemic and as high as 10% of older Australians have experienced it. That's huge. In 2016-17, there were 2,853 notifications of reportable assaults to the Department of Aged Care, and 348 of those were suspected unlawful sexual contact. That's actually reports, official reports from 1.2% of people receiving permanent residential aged care. That's pretty high. Research done by the UN into the Australian elder abuse situation shows that they estimate that there may be 20,000 unreported cases in Victoria of elder abuse, neglect and exploitation, 20,000 in New South Wales, 25,000 in Queensland, perhaps 100,000 throughout Australia based on the data that they've been able to gather. But there's no database in any state or territory to record incidents, and there's widespread confusion about who to tell when such incidents happen. Now, I think all of that's very compelling, not to mention the many anecdotal stories that we hear and that are coming out through the early days of hearings at the Commission. But why so little media coverage? It's a question that I have about this, actually. And I wondered at this, that there hasn't been much media fanfare, there hasn't been much said. Why so little interest? And I think there's probably several reasons. But I think that one reason is quite possibly the elephant in the room on this, and that is euthanasia. Euthanasia advocates, this was a huge issue, euthanasia, this time last year, but it's gone conspicuously quiet more recently. And euthanasia advocates know what works for them and what works against them. And they're highly organised. And they know that elder abuse really works against them. It works against them, because there's statistics from around the place and there's this clear evidence that elder abuse and euthanasia are a deadly cocktail. You can look, for example, to one of the jurisdictions that's had euthanasia for the longest, Oregon. And a fairly recent survey indicated that nearly 40% of euthanasia recipients in Oregon nominated concerns about being a burden on family and friends as a reason for choosing to die. Now that's pretty serious, nearly 40%. And among the many verified cases of euthanasia being administered in shocking ways in Belgium and the Netherlands, where again, Belgium, the Netherlands and Oregon have had this for the longest, and it's really quite out of control in Belgium and the Netherlands. You've got people over there being euthanized because they're blind, because they're depressed, because they're alcoholics in one case, because they're disabled, children with disabilities. 3 children actually with disabilities have been euthanized, the first in the world. People who never requested it, people who are misdiagnosed, and so on and so on. But amongst those cases, I did a quick scan of some of the ones that we've documented, and there's ones that affect the elderly as well, as you'd imagine. An elderly Dutch woman in 2017 turns out was euthanized without ever requesting it. The request was actually made for her by her family. There's criminal investigations currently ongoing in the Netherlands again, and this is a case that happened a little while ago. It wasn't referred for some time for investigation, and when it was, anyway, it's now finally being investigated, where a woman, an elderly patient, was forcibly euthanized by a doctor whilst her family held her down as she struggled. Now that's awful. There is actually the reported fact now that 1 in 60 deaths under a GP's care in Belgium are now made without an explicit request by the patient. What does that mean for dementia patients who can't make an explicit request validly? There's a 2011 survey of 800 family doctors in the Netherlands, and it found that nearly half had felt pressured by patients or their relatives to use euthanasia. So relatives of patients who are often elderly are pressuring doctors to use euthanasia. And how about this for one of the many anecdotal examples? I'll read you the example from a Dutch case, but it was referred to by Lord Ashbourne in the House of Lords euthanasia debates in the UK. And he speaks of an old man who was dying of lung cancer. His symptoms were controlled, and he asked if he could die at home. When his children were told about his wish, they would not agree to take care of him. Even after repeated discussion, they refused. Instead, they pointed to their father's suffering and the need to finish things quickly in the name of humanity. When the doctor refused, they threatened to sue him. As the patient insisted on going home, a social worker went to investigate, and she discovered that the patient's house was empty and every piece of furniture had been stripped out by the family. Do you know, if we think that euthanasia laws will not lead to a worsening of an elder abuse crisis, well, we need our heads read, because it will. That is, unfortunately, human nature and the development of seeds that are in our culture already. Do you know, I believe that you can really measure the health of a society in one way by how its elderly are treated. Scripture's full of condemnation for those who abuse the vulnerable and the widow and the elderly. And James writes, for example, that religion, which is pure before God, is this: to visit orphans and widows in their affliction and to keep oneself unstained from the world. That's a good question, you know, how are we doing on the orphan and the widow principle? Of course, the orphan and the widow will be cared for where love of neighbour, as we love ourselves, is truly practiced by people. And yet we're seeing the bitter fruit of so many avenues of corruption. You know, you think, what feeds into elder abuse, or what feeds into the neglect of the elderly? Well, it's the breakdown of family, for one, and the loneliness that that produces, particularly in old age, and sometimes at no fault of the elderly person, or the rise of narcissism, the living for ourselves without due regard for others, or the utilitarian worldview where we measure people's usefulness, we measure people's value by how useful they are. And of course, if someone's getting old, well, they're less useful, they're less valuable, or self-gratification, you know, in the way we choose friends. Friends who can do things for us, friends who make us feel good, never friends who cost something. You know, it's rotten fruit from very rotten roots. But you know, let me repeat this just in a new way. And this, as I was writing this, this occurred to me and it challenged me. How am I doing? How are we doing with the orphan and the widow principle of James 1? You know, surely the worst hypocrisy is to shout for legislative and policy change in a particular area without bothering to legislate it in our own personal lives. Do you know the example par excellence of love of neighbour is given by Jesus as the Good Samaritan? And here's a guy who personally, himself at cost to self, knelt in the dust, administered care, got his knees dirty, used his own time, spent his own money, risked himself personally at cost to serve the highest and best interests of somebody else. It's personal. We cannot virtue signal love of neighbour through calling others like the government without doing it ourselves. As you know, the Good Samaritan could have lobbied the priest and the Levite to put together a committee to stop people getting bludgeoned to death on the side of the road. Might have been a good thing to do. But see, he also personally was involved. And to preach good without doing good is wrong. And sometimes I convict myself when I speak, and particularly as a lobbyist who's always preaching about good. I think I just did, but I trust it's useful for all of us.